Grant's Crossing, Midwest Thanksgiving night. A woman sits at the edge of a dynasty that is actively trying to forget her. The air is thick with the scent of roasted meat and the suffocating heat of unearned pride, while the candlelight flickers over faces that refuse to meet mine. My name is Katherine Grant, and tonight my father is standing up to announce my permanent erasure. He thinks this dinner is a coronation for his golden son, but he has no idea that the envelope resting against my leg holds the power to strip him of his crown and burn his kingdom to the ground. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. My name is Katherine Grant, and tonight my family is about to erase me in front of everyone I've ever known. I sat halfway down the mahogany dining table, swirling the last dregs of Pinot Noir in my glass. The air in the room was thick, suffocatingly warm, and smelled of roasted turkey, expensive cologne, and centuries of unearned pride. This wasn't just Thanksgiving dinner. In the Grant household, nothing was ever just dinner. This was a staged event, a high-mass ritual for the congregation of Grant's Crossing. My father, Daniel Grant, held court at the head of the table. To his right sat the mayor. To his left, the pastor of First Methodist. And beside him, preening like a prize rooster in a custom-tailored navy suit, sat my older brother Austin. I looked at the empty space around me. I had been deliberately placed in the demilitarized zone between the power end of the table and the cousins who were too young to vote. It was a strategic geography. I was close enough to be seen in the family photos, but far enough away that no one had to actually listen to me. "Austin, tell the mayor about the numbers for Q3, my father boomed, his voice projecting like he was addressing a shareholder meeting rather than passing the cranberry sauce. Austin grinned, leaning back with a smug, practiced ease. "Record efficiency, sir. We're trimming the fat. Streamlining." "That's my boy," Daniel beamed, clapping a heavy hand on Austin's shoulder. "The future of Grant Steel is in good hands." I felt a familiar cold hollowness open up in my chest. I was a ghost in my own house. They talked over me, around me, and through me. If I asked for the salt, the conversation didn't break stride. The shaker just slid my way while eyes remained fixed on Austin. Growing up, the Grant Steel and Fabrication plant had been the heartbeat of this town. It was the reason the high school had a football stadium. It was the reason 3,000 families had health insurance. But the values I saw at this table tonight weren't the ones the company was built on. My eyes drifted to the portrait of my grandfather, Walter Grant, hanging above the mantel. I remembered him taking me through the plant when I was 8 years old. The noise had been deafening, the smell of ozone and hot metal stinging my nose. He had knelt down, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, and shouted over the roar of the stamping machines, "This place exists for the people, Katie." The moment we forget that, the moment we think we're better than the men running these presses, this place deserves to die. Walter was gone now, and the men at this table didn't care about the people. They cared about the legacy, or rather, the appearance of it. I looked back at Austin. I recognized that suit. A few months ago, I'd heard my father on the phone with his tailor promising a bespoke fit for the future CEO. Austin was wearing it tonight. And on the far wall, draped casually over an easel but clearly meant to be seen, was a mounted foam core board, a mock-up of a modernized company logo. A cousin across from me, drunk on the proximity to wealth, leaned in. "Must be nice, huh, Katie? Getting to escape to the city and play pretend while Austin stays here and does the real work. He's the one keeping the family name alive." I gripped my fork until my knuckles turned white. Escape. Play pretend. It wasn't the first time I'd heard it. The memory hit me sharp and sudden, a flashback to 5 years ago, sitting at this very table after I'd asked to be considered for an internship in operations. My father had laughed a short, dismissive bark. "This company isn't for girls, Katie. It's a hard business. Don't make us erase you from the paperwork just to keep things tidy." Erase me. The phrase had haunted me ever since. It was their favorite weapon. If I didn't fit the mold, I simply ceased to exist in the narrative. And tonight, looking at the logo, the suit, and the way the mayor hung on Austin's every word, I realized the erasure was almost complete. Suddenly, the room went quiet. The ambient chatter died down. Daniel Grant stood up. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal wine glass. Cling, cling, cling. Every face turned toward him. Eyes shone with anticipation. The mayor leaned forward. Austin adjusted his tie, trying to look humble and failing miserably. Friends, family. My father began, his voice dropping to a theatrical baritone. Thank you for sharing this bounty with us. But tonight, I have more to share than just a meal. I have a special announcement about the future of Grant Steel. My spine went cold. The room felt like a vacuum sucking the air out of my lungs. I looked at Austin's triumphant smirk, then at my father's flushed, victorious face. I knew with the certainty of a car skidding on black ice that whatever came out of his mouth next would threaten everything I had built far away from this table. To understand why this night matters, and why the silence at the dinner table felt so heavy, you have to know how long they've been trying to erase me. It didn't start with a boardroom coup or a legal document. It started years ago in the deafening roar of the factory floor with a pair of safety goggles that were 2 sizes too big for my face. I was 8 years old when my grandfather Walter first took me onto the floor. While other girls were playing with dolls, I was fascinated by the rhythm of the stamping presses and the smell of hot oil and ozone. Grandfather would hold my hand, his grip rough and calloused, and explain the logic of it all. He taught me about supply chains before I knew long division. He showed me how a delay in shipping raw ore could ripple down the line and empty a worker's refrigerator 3 weeks later. He praised my curiosity, telling anyone who would listen that I had a head for the numbers and the spirit of a builder. In those moments with the sparks flying and the machinery humming, I felt seen. I felt real. But Grandfather Walter wasn't the only power in the family. My father Daniel operated on a simpler, older code: men build and women support. In Daniel's world, my presence in the factory was a cute anomaly, something to be indulged briefly before I was shepherded back to where I belonged. My mother Linda was his silent enforcer. She was glossy polite and quietly complicit, constantly redirecting me from the study or the garage back to the kitchen to help the ladies or discuss table settings. She treated my ambition like a stain on a dress, something to be gently scrubbed away before anyone noticed. The first crack in my world happened when I was 14. I was looking over some inventory sheets left on the kitchen counter, mostly out of boredom, and I noticed a discrepancy. A clerical error in the steel coil orders was about to cost the company thousands in overstock fees. I circled it in red pen and brought it to dinner, proud of my discovery. Walter beamed, bragging about my sharp eyes. But my father just waved a fork dismissively. "She'll make a great mom someday," he said, not even looking at me. "She's thrifty. She doesn't need to worry her pretty head about steel." I remember sitting there, the praise turning to ash in my mouth. He hadn't just dismissed my work, he had defined my entire future in a single sentence, a future where my mind didn't matter. The real betrayal, the one that taught me exactly where I stood, happened 3 years later. I was 17, finishing my senior year, and I had spent weeks secretly analyzing the plant's energy consumption. I built a new scheduling system calculating that if we staggered the furnace startup times, we could slash overhead by 15%. It was brilliant, undeniable math. I printed a neat bound report and gave it to Daniel, eyes shining, thinking this would finally prove I was more than just a future housewife. He took it, nodded, and put it in his briefcase. 2 days later, I was walking past the boardroom during a quarterly meeting. The door was slightly ajar. I heard Austin's voice, smooth, confident, and utterly fraudulent. I peeked in and saw him standing at the head of the table holding my report. He was presenting my scheduling system as his own strategic initiative. He didn't even change the font. I waited for my father to correct him. I waited for him to say, "Actually, Katherine came up with this." Instead, Daniel beamed at Austin, looking around the room with swelling pride. "A born leader," he told the board. "That's the kind of vision we need." When I confronted my father later in his office, shaking with rage, he didn't apologize. He didn't even blink. "Family doesn't keep score, Katherine," he said coldly, shuffling papers on his desk. "Don't be dramatic. It looks better coming from him. He's the heir. Letting him present it helps the company, which helps you. Don't threaten what we're building with your petty jealousy. That was the first time he used that word against me. Threaten. As if my desire to be credited for my own mind was an act of violence against the family. The final blow came when grandfather Walter passed away. The day after the funeral, Daniel moved into the big corner office. The first thing he did was remove the framed photo of me and Walter standing in front of the number 4 press. In its place, he hung a glossy professional portrait of Austin in a suit. I stood in the doorway and watched him do it. That was the night I realized they weren't just ignoring me, they were actively rewriting the story without me. I was being edited out of the legacy in real time. I made my choice then. I secretly applied to business schools out of state, aiming for anywhere but here. When the acceptance letters came, Daniel refused to sign the financial support forms. "College is pointless for you," he sneered. "You're just going to get a degree and marry some guy anyway. I won't pay for a 4-year vacation." I left at dawn the next morning with one suitcase, a partial scholarship, and a heart hardened by rejection. I felt liberated but also heartbreakingly alone. I told myself I was walking toward freedom, but deep down, the wound was raw. Back in the present, the sound of a spoon tapping against glass snapped me out of the memory. Daniel lifted his wineglass high, the candlelight reflecting in the red liquid. "Tonight," he announced, "we honor the future of Grant Steel." I stared at him, gripping the stem of my own glass. I thought leaving town had freed me from them. I didn't know they'd still find a way to threaten everything I was years later and hundreds of miles away. Chicago was nothing like the sprawling, quiet acres of Grant's Crossing. It was a cacophony of sirens, wind, and ambition, a place where the skyline cut the clouds like a jagged saw blade. My life there started in a shoebox apartment with a radiator that hissed like an angry cat and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. I worked 3 part-time jobs, barista, data entry clerk, and library shelver, just to pay for my night classes. I was perpetually exhausted, my eyes stinging from lack of sleep and too much coffee, but for the first time in my life, I was breathing oxygen that felt entirely my own. In the city, nobody cared about my last name. Nobody knew about the Grants or the steel mill or the legacy I was supposed to be mourning. Here I was, just a number on an exam paper or a nameless girl pouring lattes. It was the purest form of American freedom I had ever tasted, the freedom to be judged solely on my results. If I worked hard, I passed. If I showed up, I got paid. There was no nepotism, no hidden agendas, and no father looming over me to tell me my place. I wasn't entirely alone, though. Tiana Brooks, a graphic designer with hair dyed a defiant electric blue and a heart made of solid gold, became my roommate and my chosen sister. Tiana was blunt, fiercely loyal, and the first person to tell me that my family's treatment of me wasn't normal. "They didn't just overlook you, Kat," she told me one night over cheap takeout noodles. "They tried to bury you. There's a difference." She became my anchor, the person who reminded me that I existed when the silence from home got too loud. I poured my frustration into my studies, excelling in finance and operations. I found a strange comfort in balance sheets. Numbers, unlike families, didn't lie. A professor, Dr. Rivera, took notice of my obsession with efficiency. She told me I had a rare talent for spotting structural weaknesses in companies, for seeing the cracks in the foundation before the walls came down. With her recommendation, I landed an internship at a boutique restructuring firm. We specialized in failing family businesses, companies rotting from the inside due to mismanagement and ego. It was ironic, almost dark humor, that I was building a career fixing the exact kind of dysfunction I had run away from. I became known around the office as the analyst who never went home. I dug through ledgers until my vision blurred, finding lost revenue and hidden debts that the senior partners missed. By the time I graduated, I had a full-time offer and a reputation as a fixer. Amidst the grind, I met Mark Ellis. He was an electrician who worked on commercial high-rises, a man with calloused hands and a smile that reached his eyes. Mark was everything the men in my family were not: grounded, kind, and secure in himself. He didn't need a title to feel important. He came home with drywall dust on his boots and stories about the guys on his crew, and he listened, really listened when I talked about my day. Our relationship anchored me in a version of life that was healthy and loving, the polar opposite of the emotional starvation I'd grown up with. I kept this new life hermetically sealed from Grant's Crossing. I refused to call home, and I muted the family group chat, though I never quite found the courage to leave it. I'd see the notifications pile up photos of Austin's new truck jokes about his future CEO status, praise from my mother about how handsome he looked. They were broadcasting a highlight reel of a life I was excluded from. I consciously chose silence. If they wanted to erase me, I decided I'd give them a blank page. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing I was struggling, nor would I give them the chance to belittle my successes. Yet, guilt is a stubborn ghost. While I was thriving climbing the corporate ladder and building a life with Mark, I carried a low-level hum of anxiety about the town I left behind. I knew the factory workers. I knew their names, their kids, the way the town died a little every time a shift was cut. I rationalized my distance, telling myself, it's not my responsibility. They made their choices. They chose Austin. But every time I opened a case file on a dying manufacturing plant, I felt a phantom pain, a reminder of the grandfather who told me the factory belonged to the people. One Tuesday evening in November, that phantom pain became a very real blow. I was alone in the office, the city lights flickering below me, reviewing a confidential deck of distressed companies that were potential acquisition targets for a ruthless private equity client. My job was to flag the ones that were ripe for a takeover, companies with valuable assets but incompetent leadership. I clicked to the next slide, taking a sip of lukewarm water. Then I froze. My hand hovered over the mouse, trembling. The water turned to acid in my stomach. On the screen in front of my entire team's empty desks was a rust-red logo I'd know even in a nightmare. It was the logo of Grant Steel and Fabrication, and right below it, stamped in bold, unforgiving red letters, were the words, "High distress, potential liquidation." The world narrowed down to the size of that projection screen. My ears started ringing a high-pitched whine that drowned out the hum of the HVAC system. Tunnel vision set in, turning the edges of the room gray. I felt like I was physically falling the floor, dropping out from under my swivel chair. Grant Steel, my grandfather's legacy. The town's lifeline wasn't just struggling, it was on a kill list. I forced myself to breathe. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, using the sharp pain to snap my brain back into analyst mode. I couldn't be the daughter right now. I had to be the professional. "What's the debt load?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "And the ownership structure, is the board looking to restructure or liquidate?" The senior partner flicked to the next slide. "Heavy leverage, the bank is squeezing them. Management is incompetent, classic second-generation fumble. They're looking for a buyout, but honestly it's an asset strip play. The land is worth more than the business. We'd gut the machinery, sell the inventory, and level the buildings for commercial zoning." Asset strip. The words made me sick. I saw images of the factory, hollowed out the windows, smashed the silence, where 3 shifts of workers used to earn a living. I saw families in Grant's Crossing packing up U-Hauls because there were no jobs left. I excused myself, my legs feeling like lead, and walked into the fire exit stairwell. The concrete was cold and echoed with the distant sounds of the city. I pulled out my phone and dialed my father. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the device. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding annoyed. "Katherine, I'm busy." "Dad, listen to me," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "I know about the bank pressure. I know you're looking for a buyer. You need to stop. The people looking at you, they aren't going to save the company. They're going to scrap it." There was a pause and then a scoff. "You read numbers on a screen, Katherine. I run a real operation. Don't presume to tell me how to handle my business." "It's not just business, it's foreclosure risk. I've seen the profile. If you sell to these firms, they will close the plant within 6 months. "Enough," he barked. "I have a strategy. Austin and I are handling it. Don't threaten my reputation with your big city theories and your hysteria. We're upgrading. You wouldn't understand." He hung up. The silence in the stairwell was deafening. I stared at the phone, desperation clawing at my throat. I opened my text thread with Austin. Me, Austin. Dad isn't listening. The sale rumors are bad. They want to liquidate. Is this true? 3 minutes later, a reply popped up. Austin. Relax, sis. It's big boy business. We're cashing out and moving up. Don't worry, you'll still get a Christmas card. Stay in your lane. He didn't care. He actually didn't care. He was talking about a sale that would upgrade their lives, while erasing the livelihoods of the people who built that wealth. He saw the workers as liabilities, not people. I left the office and walked out onto the street. It was rush hour, and thousands of strangers streamed past me, intent on their destinations. I found a concrete bench and sat down, burying my face in my hands. I was at a moral crossroads, and the weight of it was crushing. I could walk away. I could let them sell. I could let them crash and burn. It would be the ultimate punishment. They would lose the legacy they idolized, and I would be safe in Chicago, blameless. But then I remembered Walter. I remembered his hand on my shoulder, his voice cutting through the factory noise. This place exists for the people, Katie. If I let the company die to spite my father, I was no better than him. I would be sacrificing the town to feed my own grievance. I stood up. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I went back inside, but not to work for my firm. I went to my desk and pulled up the public records on Grant Steel. I spent the next 6 hours digging. I pulled incorporation papers from 40 years ago. I traced stock transfers, probate records from grandfather's death, and dividend payouts. I built a new spreadsheet naming the file simply Control Path, Grant Steel. What I found made my heart hammer against my ribs. Walter Grant had been a man of the people, and he had distributed ownership like a community garden. He never fully consolidated the shares. There were blocks of stock scattered everywhere, gifted to early employees, left to distant cousins, held by old partners who had retired to Florida. My father, Daniel, held a large stake, yes. But as I crunched the numbers, realized the truth: he didn't have 51%. He had never bothered to secure a mathematical majority because he ruled by intimidation and inertia. Everyone just assumed he owned it all because he acted like a king. Legally, he didn't own the narrative. I stared at the glowing screen, a slow realization dawning on me. If they could erase me from the story, I whispered to the empty office, I could rewrite the ending. My eyes scanned the list of minority shareholders. One name stood out. Joe Ramirez, Walter's old foreman and right-hand man. I picked up my phone. It was late, but I knew Joe. He was an insomniac who listened to talk radio. I dialed the number. Hello? A gruff, tired voice answered. Joe, it's Katherine Grant. There was a long silence on the line, then a soft exhale. Kathy, I've been wondering when you'd call. Your granddad said once you'd be the one to save this place if your parents didn't erase you first. Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them away. Joe, I said, my voice steady as steel. I need your shares, and I need your help. The next 3 weeks were a blur of highway motels, stale coffee, and the quiet, desperate work of gathering an army. I wasn't fighting with guns or shouting matches. I was fighting with ink and paper. It started with Joe Ramirez. We met at a low-key diner halfway between Chicago and Grant's Crossing, a place where the waitress called everyone honey and didn't ask questions. Joe looked older than I remembered, his knuckles swollen from arthritis earned after 40 years on the line. I didn't appeal to his emotion. I showed him the real financials. I showed him the foreclosure notices I'd dug up. When he realized Daniel was driving the company off a cliff, he didn't hesitate. He signed over his voting rights to my holding company, his hand shaking slightly. For Walter, he whispered. From there, I drove 3 states over to find Aunt Marlene. She was a distant cousin who had practically lived in the finishing department in the 80s, breathing in fumes until her lungs gave out. My father had quietly cut off her small stipend years ago, calling it Unnecessary overhead. When I showed up at her porch, she looked at me like I was a ghost. She didn't care about the stock value. She cared that someone from the family had finally come to see her. She signed her shares over in gratitude, squeezing my hand. You have your grandfather's eyes, Katherine. Don't let them forget that. The hardest battle was Leonard Price. He was an estranged co-founder who had left the company 15 years ago after a screaming match with my father about ethics. Leonard was wealthy, bitter, and living in Florida. He wouldn't meet in person, so I faced him on a video call, his face pixelated and skeptical. He grilled me for an hour about my motives, my resume, and my plan. He wanted to know if I was just another Grant playing power games. To manage the logistics, I hired Elena Cho, a hard-edged corporate attorney in Chicago who specialized in hostile takeovers. She was brilliant and terrifyingly efficient. Together, we set up a series of neutral-sounding LLCs, Apex Holdings, Midwest Ventures, to hold the accumulating shares. The strategy was simple: buy small blocks of stock quietly so that no single transaction triggered a notification requirement for Daniel. We were building a majority brick by brick, invisible to the radar. One night, sitting in her glass-walled office surrounded by takeout containers, Elena paused. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. Katherine, we're getting close. But you need to know, once they realize what you're doing, they will come for you. They'll threaten everything. Your reputation, your career, maybe even your physical safety. You sure this isn't just revenge? I looked out at the city lights. I wanted to say it wasn't, but part of it was. I remembered the years of being sidelined, the way they made me feel small so they could feel big. It's not just revenge, I said finally, but it is justice. They use the word threaten to control me my whole life. Maybe the only thing I threaten is the lie they've been living. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with Leonard Price. He held a decisive 7% stake. If I got him, I crossed the threshold. If I lost him, I was just a minority nuisance. He called me back on a Tuesday night. "Are you doing this to destroy your father?" he asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I closed my eyes, thinking of the factory floor, of the families in town, and of the hollow man at the head of the table. "No," I answered, and I realized I meant it. "I'm not doing this to destroy him. I'm doing this so he can't destroy everyone else." I heard the scratch of a pen on paper through the speaker. "Done," Leonard said. "Go get him, kid." I rushed back to Elena's office. She was already tallying the totals. She looked up, a rare smile breaking her stoic expression. "It's confirmed. Through the entities, you control 51.4% of the voting stock." I sat back in the leather chair, the breath rushing out of me. On paper, I had stripped them of the power they'd always used to strip me of my place. It was a silent, bloodless coup. In one series of signatures, I stripped them of their invisible crown, and they didn't even know it was gone yet. The next morning, an email pinged on my phone. It was a mass invitation from my mother, Thanksgiving family dinner. "Please join us for a special announcement about the future of Grant Steel." I smiled coldly. I knew exactly what that announcement was. Daniel was planning his public coronation for Austin. He was going to announce the sale, the payout, and the succession. I packed a bag. I wasn't going to hide in Chicago. I tucked a thick manila envelope heavy with the transfer deeds and legal filings into my leather satchel. They thought this dinner would be the night they finally erased me. Instead, it would be the night I stepped out of the margin and rewrote the entire story. I started the car and turned onto the highway, headed home. The room had dissolved into a sea of applause, the sound crashing against my ears like static. We were back in the moment, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat and heavy perfume. My father, Daniel, stood tall at the head of the table, basking in the adulation. He had just finished his grand speech framing the upcoming sale of Grant Steel, not as a failure, but as a strategic evolution. "And to lead this transition," Daniel boomed, raising his glass higher, "to guide the company into a profitable sale that will secure this family for generations, I present the new CEO of Grant Steel, Austin Grant." Austin stood up, buttoning his jacket with a practiced, arrogant smoothness. He looked like a king accepting his crown. "Thank you, Dad," he said, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's a heavy responsibility, but we have to make the hard choices. It's a necessary sacrifice for the family and the town." The mayor nodded solemnly. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. It was a perfect performance. Then Austin got comfortable. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was the intoxicating rush of unchecked power, but he leaned in toward the mayor, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial volume that still carried clearly down the table. "Honestly, the first thing is trimming the fat. We've got guys on the floor who've been there 30 years costing us a fortune in benefits. We automate them out, clean up the balance sheet, and the buyer pays a premium. Simple as that." He chuckled, a wet, ugly sound. "Out with the old right." He wasn't talking about numbers. He was talking about men like Joe Ramirez. He was talking about reducing human lives that had built this house to line items to be deleted. That was the snap. The final tether binding me to their silence broke. I set my wineglass down on the table with a deliberate, heavy thud. The sound was sharp enough to cut through the chatter. The table went quiet. Heads turned. Austin froze mid-laugh, looking annoyed at the interruption. "Are you sure you want to tell that story in front of everyone, Austin?" I asked. My voice was calm, terrifyingly steady. "Because I brought receipts." I reached into my bag, pulled out the thick manila envelope, and slid it across the white linen tablecloth. It hissed as it moved, stopping perfectly between Daniel and Austin. "What is this?" Daniel demanded, his brow furrowing. "Katherine, we are in the middle of a celebration. Don't cause a scene." "Open it," I said. Daniel glared at me, then snatched the envelope. He ripped it open, pulling out the summary of ownership transfers. He scanned the first page, then the second. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving him a pale, waxen gray. His hands began to shake, rattling the papers. This isn't possible," he whispered. "What?" Austin asked, leaning over. "What is it?" I didn't wait for him to explain. I addressed the room, my voice projecting to the mayor, the pastor, and every cousin who had mocked me. "That document confirms that through a series of acquisitions over the last 3 weeks, I have secured 51.4% of the voting stock in Grant Steel," I announced. "I am the majority shareholder. The sale you are planning is legally blocked, and Austin's appointment as CEO is invalid without my signature." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb having gone off just before the shockwave hits. I looked directly at my father. "You tried to erase me from the legacy. You spent my whole life pushing me into the margins, but you forgot the one thing you taught me: the person who owns the ink decides what gets written." Daniel exploded. He slammed the papers down, knocking over his wineglass. The red stain spread across the tablecloth like a wound. "You traitor!" he roared, veins bulging in his neck. "You stole this! You stole my life's work! How dare you come into my house and threaten me?" "I didn't steal anything," I countered, my voice rising to meet his. "I bought it, fair market value, which is more than you were going to give the town." "You've destroyed this family," my mother sobbed, clinging to Austin, who looked shattered, staring at the table as if his entire reality had dissolved. "Katherine, how could you—" "I didn't destroy it," I said, pointing at the papers. "Read the financials, Mother. Dad wasn't saving the company. He was facing foreclosure. The deal he set up would have stripped the plant bare, fired the workers, and sold the land for scrap. You weren't saving the town. You were cashing out and leaving the rest of us to sift through the rubble." The mayor looked at Daniel, eyes wide with shock. "Daniel, is that true foreclosure?" Daniel ignored him. He was staring at me with a hatred so pure it felt like physical heat. "If you do this," he spat, "if you humiliate us like this, you are no daughter of mine. You are dead to me." Years ago, that would have broken me. It would have sent me running to my room in tears. But tonight, it landed differently. It landed on armor. I stood up, smoothing my dress. "You already tried to erase me as your daughter, Dad. You did that years ago. I'm just refusing to stay erased. I turned my back on them. I walked out of the dining room, the sound of my heels clicking on the hardwood floor, the only sound in the house. I left the envelope there, a tombstone for their ambition. I walked out the front door into the biting cold of the November night. I stood on the porch and looked out toward the valley where the distant amber glow of the Grant Steel factory lit up the low-hanging clouds. They thought this dinner would strip me of everything: my voice, my history, my name. Instead, it stripped them of the one thing they'd never deserved: unchecked power. The fallout was immediate and brutal. By the time the sun rose over Grant's Crossing the next morning, the gossip mill had already churned out a verdict. I was the ungrateful daughter who had stole the company from her dying father. In the grocery store, people turned their carts down different aisles to avoid me. At the gas station, the attendant wouldn't look me in the eye. The fear in the town was palpable. They thought I was a corporate raider from the city come to carve up the carcass of the local economy. I refused to hide in the executive suite. I knew that silence would only let the lie take root. 3 days after the dinner, I called a mandatory all-staff meeting. I didn't hold it in the boardroom. I held it in the plant break room, a space that smelled of hydraulic fluid and stale coffee. I stood on a reinforced shipping crate so I could see over the sea of hard hats and crossed arms. The hostility was a physical weight in the room. "I know what you've heard," I said, my voice echoing off the cinderblock walls. "You heard I stole this company. You heard I'm here to sell you out." I held up the financial reports, the real ones, not the glossy brochures my father liked to print. But the truth is in the math. The sale my father and brother were arranging wasn't a rescue. It was a liquidation. I looked at the faces in the front row, men and women who had worked for my grandfather. The deal my father wanted would have stripped them of their homes, their dignity, and their future. I won't let that happen. I stopped the sale because I intend to keep these machines running. I used those words deliberately. Strip them. I saw a flicker of recognition in the eyes of an older foreman. The shift wasn't instant. It took months of grinding work. I replaced the dangerous, outdated stamping presses my father had ignored. I instituted a fairer overtime policy. Slowly, the crossed arms began to drop. One afternoon, that same foreman stopped me on the floor. He didn't smile, but he nodded. "You fixed the safety guard on line 4, he grunted. "Your dad stepped over that broken guard for 10 years. Thanks." It was a small victory, but it felt like winning a war. The war with my family was colder. Daniel refused to set foot in the plant, stewing in his humiliation at the country club. My mother Linda called me once, her voice trembling with accusation. "You chose money over family, Katherine. You broke your father's heart." "I chose the truth, Mom," I replied, staring at a photo of Walter on my desk. "You chose to look away. There's a difference." It took 6 months for Daniel to resurface. He appeared at a quarterly board meeting looking smaller, his suit hanging a little loose on his frame. He sat at the far end of the table, not at the head. He was a minority shareholder now, and he knew it. During a break, he approached me. He didn't grovel, and he didn't hug me. He just cleared his throat and looked at the floor. "The numbers on the acquisition," he mumbled. "You were right about the leverage. I missed it." It was a halting, imperfect apology, but for a man like Daniel Grant, it was a surrender. I accepted it, but I kept my boundaries. I offered forgiveness, not the keys to the castle. Austin's journey was harder. He spiraled for a while, angry and lost without the title he believed was his birthright. Eventually, stripped of the illusion, he had to find reality. He took a sales job in a neighboring state, a regular job with a boss and quotas, and no family name to protect him. Late one night, I got a text from him. "You were right. I never actually did the work. I'm learning how to do it now. We aren't close and maybe we never will be, but for the first time, our relationship is built on honesty instead of favoritism." A year later, Thanksgiving looked very different. There was no mahogany table, no mayor, and no stage speeches. We gathered in my Chicago apartment, crowded around a mismatched table that Tiana had dragged in from a thrift store. Mark was there carving the turkey with an electrician's precision. Elena was arguing playfully with one of the plant supervisors about baseball. It was chaotic, loud, and messy. It was built on mutual respect, not fear. I stepped out onto the balcony for a moment of quiet, the cold city air biting at my cheeks. I looked at the skyline, thinking of the factory lights miles away. This story had tested everything I believed in. It tested my resilience, forcing me to stand when I wanted to fold. It tested my understanding of community, teaching me that family isn't just blood, it's the people who show up when the chips are down. And it tested my freedom, proving that I didn't have to live inside a role written by someone else. To anyone listening whose family tries to erase them, to anyone told they are a threat just for wanting more than the scraps, to anyone sitting at a table that doesn't recognize their worth, know that you can build your own table. My name is Katherine Grant. I was the daughter they tried to erase, the threat they never saw coming. They planned a dinner to strip me of my place. Instead, I stripped them of their illusion of control and built a life, a company, and a table they can never write me out of again. Catherine's journey from the shadows to the head of the table reminds us that the best revenge is often just refusing to be written out of your own story. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and resilience, please consider subscribing for more. Tell us in the comments, would you have forgiven the family or walked away entirely? We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Radiance. We'll see you next time.